For today's postcard, we're in the Shire town of Warwickshire. We're in Warwick and Warwick Castle. Some people say, Janet, that this is the greatest medieval castle in Britain. Is it?
Yes. Definitely yes. I've got to say that.
Yes.
You know, because it is. I mean, it has 1,000 years of history within these walls.
And its bulk is just incredible. To me, it looks even bigger than the town of Warwick. I've never been to Warwick. It's a postcard's first for me. But Warwick itself is quite weeny compared with the castle, which is quite huge. Which came first?
Well, there was a small town here, but not as we see it today. There's still a lot of Elizabethan buildings within the town. And when they built the castle, they actually knocked down about 12 or 13 houses to get the perimeter of the castle in.
So, in other words, the settlement to the town of Warwick was there.
There was a settlement, that's the right word, Russell.
Here.
Yeah.
But there wasn't much going on. So did the town really sort of come into its own during the Elizabethan times?
Yes, it did. Queen Elizabeth visited this castle, as so many monarchs did, and of course, as we do today, Russell, everything got tarted up for Elizabeth I. You know, in fact, the Earl had to move out because you brought so many people here.
What was here before there was this magnificent castle?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, there's 1,000 years of history, and of course there was the mound. I mean, not as we see it today, because if I'm honest, that's a Victorian folly. But in this area, there was a fortress, a wooden fortress, of course, and that was at the turn of the 900s. You're looking at 916, 918, something
Saxon
like that.
times?
You're right, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
And who founded that?
Well, it was Elfrida's mound, or Elfrida's, I should say, mound, and she was supposedly was the daughter of King Arthur.
King Alfred.
King Alfred.
That's right, but King Arthur will do.
Yeah, that would
if
do.
we're going into the land of myths and legends.
Some people have even said that Warwick Castle is a myth.
Well, there we are.
There you are,
so
you see.
We'll live with Arthur and Alfred.
Thanks a lot.
So we've got King Alfred here and his daughter because this is a natural mound. Presumably no one dumped it here.
No.
It was there for a natural defence.
Yeah.
So we've got the Saxons. What are we talking about then where this really came into its own as a very powerful residence?
It really came in as its own in the medieval times, and certainly, of course, when it got tied up with Richard Neville.
And that's Wars of the Roses.
And that's Wars of the Roses. You're looking at the sort of 14th and 15th century.
That's when it really rose to prominence.
Yes.
A huge defensive area.
Yeah.
And is that the time then when the Earls of Warwick themselves were the premier title in the land?
Oh yes.
Tell us what happened then during this time of the Wars of the Roses. Why Warwick the Kingmaker?
Well, there's always an element of folklore in history, as I know you appreciate,
yes,
Russell.
That's right. Well, Chinese whispers.
That's right.
I told him and she told me. I don't believe it.
Yeah, you're right. That's right. And so it does get changed. But of course, he wasn't called the Kingmaker, Neville, until after his death. And the reason for that was that he had the power of two kings. He was the power behind the throne. Lots of people will say, well, he wanted the throne himself. No, he didn't. He knew. He may have been ambitious, but he knew he could never get the throne. But he wanted to be the power. And he actually had Edward IV imprisoned at Warwick Castle.
Medieval Europe was a place of suspicion and total paranoia. Much of the English Empire stretched all the way into France. And during the reigns of Richard II and then Henry VI, much of the empire was lost. And it was at this time that two dynasties, York and Lancaster, came on the scene and decided it was their chance to go for the throne of England. The king was weak and basically the government was falling apart. So the houses of York and Lancaster took it upon themselves to go to war, to go to battle, in what we know, of course, as the Wars of the Roses. There were many wars, started in 1455, ending in 1471. Yorkists, the White Rose, Lancaster, the Red Rose. But there was one man who held the sway of power, of political power, A student, one would think of someone like Machiavelli, who would have changed sides, swapped sides, just so he could have the power. He wasn't a legitimate claimant to the throne of England, but he had all the trappings of it, particularly here at a place like Warwick Castle, and we're talking about the Earl of Warwick. He had a relationship, a friendship with Edward IV, who was a long-time claimant to the throne of England. And in fact, he himself turned out to be one of the main protagonists. And of course, on the other side, you had Henry VI, who was already on the throne. So the two of them locked horns, but it was this man who wielded the main power. And here he is in Warwick, in this fabulous tableau, where everything seems so real. And he's about to go and fight at his final battle. It's the Second Battle of Barnet, and that's where he met his end. And one could say, well, was all that war futile? Was he really the kingmaker, as they gave him that particular title in the 19th century, long after? But of course he was, because in the end it was his friend, Edward IV, who claimed the throne of England. Was it because of Warwick? Warwick lost his life in the Battle of Barnet, pulled from his horse, throat slit. But here we are in Warwick Castle, home of the Kingmaker. The Wars of the Roses is one of the most intricate political games that ever occurred in British history, English history. People often talk about Oliver Cromwell and the Civil War as though it was the only one. The Wars of the Roses was one of the most profound events in English, therefore British history.
That's right.
Wasn't it? And it was the first of the major civil wars.
I think one of the most touching statements I've ever read in history was by Henry VI, who I have to say I am not a follower of. But he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Edward went there and he said, I'm right glad to see you, cousin. I know my life is safe in your hands. And within 6 weeks he was dead.
Now, just in case you're confused, Edward IV is a Yorkist and sports the white rose, and Henry VI is a Lancastrian and wears the red rose. But you know, Warwick himself lived like a king, very extravagantly. In fact, his financial advisor was always urging him caution. He wanted his soldiers to be dressed in the finest of garb. And his financial advisor said, by all means, my lord, dress all of your soldiers in red jackets, wearing the bear and the ragged staff, Warwick's emblem. But it would cost a king's ransom. And Neville replied, in which case, my friend, my dear friend, I shall ransom a king. And you know, at one point he held both claimants to the throne in prison. He held Henry down in the Tower of London and Edward here at Warwick. 3 kings, or just 2, and 1 kingmaker? Take us for a tour around this castle and give us some of the highlights, the high spots of it.
Right. H.G. Wells was a great friend of the 5th Countess of Warwick, and he wrote a book, as everybody knows, a 20th century classic called The Time Machine, and that's what Warwick Castle is. It's a time machine. You will go through Neville's time, 1471, preparation for battle. You will go through the Georgian rooms, the state rooms that were used for all the monarchy that visited this castle. You will go through the Victorian house, the Royal Weekend Party, and you will meet people like Clara Butt, Winston Churchill, the Duke and Duchess of
Did
Marlborough.
they actually ever come here?
Oh yes, I have the visitors book.
So in
that
other
went there.
words, all of the tableaus that you see here are based on true Warwick history?
Oh yes.
And it's interesting, you know, you've got lots of people coming through here now. You are in November, which is meant to be the closed season,
Yes,
shall we say.
yes.
And yet you have this magnetic attraction still to come to this castle. People do, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And the reason for that, Russell, is you've seen it for yourself, and that is that it is a living castle.
It's a fascinating place, and certainly some of the tableau scenes, when you go through there, I think what makes this castle very different for me is you walk into those rooms, which I did as I walked through, and I saw Clara Butt singing, and I saw this woman on the couch, and I really didn't know, and you must get so many people who do not know the difference between human flesh and waxwork image.
I have to tell you something, Russell. Guides here, if I get any complaint at all, that's the one, because they hate it when guests say, "Are you real?"
I know, but that is, of course, a tremendous accolade to the people who've done those waxworks, because you do walk through different parts of English, then British history, and then you think to yourself, my goodness, it comes alive. I find it spooky, I find it scary, I find it also fascinating and intriguing, because what that does, you feel that there's life happening in there still.